Okay. Hello, everyone, and welcome to our first day of the SEO for Developers series on Live with... Okay. Don't start yet. Oh, start at 10, am I right about that? Okay. Well, hello, everybody. Welcome to our first day of the Live SEO for Developers series on Live with Search Engine Land. My name is Detlef Johnson, and I'm editor-at-large, and particularly my area of focus is on tech SEO and SEO for developers. So over the next 3 days, we have some exciting interactive sessions, including discussions, including live coding and Q&A with the experts that we're going to have on this week. They are all very knowledgeable in coding and how that coding, especially how that coding affects your SEO. We definitely want to hear from you, and there will be plenty of time for questions. So be sure to scroll down and put your question in the live Q&A. We'll get to as many of the questions as we can throughout this session, and there may be some questions that we don't get to, but we're also planning to try out and schedule a Google Meet after the fact. So try and sign up for that if you can for some live Q&A afterwards with the speakers who should be able to join as well. And now, to get things started, we're going to talk about communications primarily, and this is where the rubber meets the road between SEO, tech SEO, and maybe the developers working on the project that you've been brought into. And so we have some speakers today who have representation from both the agency side of things in that regard, but also speakers who represent client side as well, who have, they're the stakeholder in the SEO as part of a team, and how she can discuss SEO topics with the team and get things implemented. So it's let's welcome our speakers. We have today these two fabulous speakers. First, Anthony Muller, president of ZenSEM, and we have Katie Meurin, director of SEO and content strategy at Southern New Hampshire University. Don't forget to add your questions to the live Q&A box at the bottom of the screen, and we'll get to as many as we can. So this is a live discussion between us all. And to start things off, it'd be fun to hear a bit of a story. Anybody got a story for us to begin discussions? that's queuing it up for Anthony, for those who know.
Yeah, many stories. So we've been doing this for 20 plus years, and the stories that we have are kind of Grimm's fairy tale like in some instances. But my hope here is that by sharing some of these, what we can all do is learn from some issues that have happened during replatforming, specifically with React, with a number of different clients. So I'll go over clients such as JW Player, Wirecutter, MSN, Inside Hook, a bunch of different ones. I'm not going to name specific names for various reasons, but we'll talk about the first story about the dev who had me install screen doors on a submarine. Is that the one that you think would be best in this situation?
That's got me intrigued. I'm not quite connecting that with a story I'm familiar with. So go ahead.
Okay, so I was brought in to cover for an in-house SEO that was out on leave. So it was a large publication. They had things done very well. She was very talented. So I was just supposed to come in, turn some dials, do some stuff. No emergencies, would be an easy gig. That's when I should always kick myself. Whenever I hear easy gig, kick yourself. But what had happened was all of a sudden, within 30 days of taking the gig, traffic had tanked 20-30%. I did a forensic audit, looked into it, and found out there were a bunch of technical issues that were causing the problem. The lead dev at the time was a little bit obdurate, and, well, how do we know it's that? How do we know it's not something else? Which the answer is, you really don't know. You just have a gut instinct and a lot of experience to be able to try and guide it in that way. However, we made the changes, and right before the busiest time of year, we saw a 40-point swing to the upside. Millions in additional revenues. The GM had said, "I'm in awe," so this is great. At that point, the lead dev had decided to replatform in React. This is content that changes every 3 months to every 6 months. So I had to kind of send out the email. And as we've discussed time and time again, Detlef, that you really should need React before you decide to go down that road, especially when 80% of your revenues are coming from search, right? You want to be careful, really have the need to do it. But my main...
And for a little context, React is a JavaScript framework that in the title of the framework itself, React, means reactivity, meaning that if the state in the database changes, those changes should bubble up to the screen without a user having to refresh. Reactive code, you've seen this it's a Facebook project. If you're looking at Facebook and you look at the notifications and you can see that you get new notifications added, that's not as a result of you refreshing that page. So in your project, nothing changed for 6 months. So why React?
I think it was the cool new thing that everybody wanted to jump in on, maybe get it on the resume. Hey, we platformed to React, right? Whatever the case, they decided to go that way against the warnings, right? So my bar was, okay, you're on WordPress, and before we go live with React, I want to make sure that, everything, all the elements are visible like they would be if you viewed source in HTML, right? You looked at it, you saw the links and the modules, right? But also, we at least have to meet, it'd be great to beat, but we at least have to meet the timings, the performance timings that we were getting in WordPress, which, if you drank a bottle of tequila or spun around in your office chair about 20 times, it's kind of hard not to beat, we all know WordPress can be a little slow at times. So anyway, that was the goal. Within a couple of weeks, they were ready to flip the switch. They flipped the switch on some of the content, not all of it. And we did notice that traffic had dipped about 20%. So in working with this head dev, I said, look, this doesn't look good. It looks like this is the cause. And the argument was, well, the dip happened a day before I flipped the switch and put in this reverse proxy, which I wasn't told about. And so it becomes kind of a, how do you know 100% this is the issue? And you can't really know with SEO that it's 100%. All you could do is go by your gut and say, I've seen this before many times. It's likely what's happening now. So the promises were, okay, we're going to work on performance. We'll get it up to speed. We'll come through the other side of this tunnel. And as an outside consultant, and Katie, you probably have a different perspective being inside, but when a client tells you, I'm going to install screen doors on the submarine, you say, well, that might not be the best idea, but if you're going to do it, damn it, I'm going to help you do it, And so that was the deal.
That screen doors in the submarine analogy I didn't quite catch earlier to match it up with that project, but I'm familiar with that project. I know exactly what you experienced.
Yeah.
Katie's experiences, she, as a stakeholder, she also has to speak with developers and get involved in the workflow there, and it's still, there's some commonalities here because as a stakeholder in the SEO, you're keen to make sure they implement things that are going to help the visibility and not cause detriments. So how about a little bit of a story from that perspective?
Sure. I think in the beginning for me, it was just that it was very siloed. So I started at Southern New Hampshire University 4 years ago, and there was just different direct reports for the developers and for SEO, and I didn't feel like there was a lot of alignment. So in the beginning, I was kind of just like shooting out web tickets, and they were just making a giant pile for the developers, and everyone was doing the same thing throughout the university, is just throwing in web tickets to the same place. And so I think the developers just had this giant pile of work and not enough resources. So for me, it was just, how do I figure out how to get these SEO projects prioritized? And I think a lot of the early advice that I got was, well, you have to build relationships with the developers. You got to take them out for coffee or buy them beer, or make them cupcakes. And I kept thinking, like, I don't know. I feel like my work is important. So if it's important, they'll prioritize it. And if it's not, then they won't. Like, I don't know what they're working on that's more important. It could be more important than what I'm asking for. So I think one of the best things early on was just figuring out, like, what they were up against. Like, basically they had just like 10 top priorities, and then I was just like sprinkling in more stuff along the way. So it had to start from above them to say, like, hey, we're just jamming stuff into the same group. Like, how are we prioritizing it? And so the organization started doing that anyhow, but I think just me, like, learning how do I submit a business case so that I can get my projects in, and listening to what they needed too. Like, I think a lot of times it's just creating a sense of urgency and creating data-driven stories and making sure that you're getting to the right advocates to help the projects get through. But I think initially I kept thinking, like, I just kept hearing the advice at conferences, like, you just have to go right to the developer and you just have to make a friend. And
Did you try pizza?
I have tried pizza.
Yeah.
And I think that if SEO is important, or if whatever technology the developer is trying to push is important, then prioritization should be based on business impact.
Totally. Yeah, sounds like you tried everything. If you got to pizza. Anthony, did pizza help your case at all, or not even close?
No, I tried vodka. I tried anything you could, setting bottles of stuff. But at some point, look, and I don't want to say the whole team, the team as a whole, they have everybody pulling at them, which I'm sure you're aware of. They have product pulling at. They have their next project, so they have all these things. And our goal as SEOs is to try and say, okay, let's put this on the roadmap and tell them the priority of this. Like, this is how much it's impacting traffic, or how much it could impact traffic, right? And that helps them say, okay, that's backlogged, or let's push this to the next sprint, right? But at the end of the day, in this situation, the lead dev really was very obdurate, let's just put it that way, and was then, after a while, given a leadership role of figuring out what the SEO problems were. Kind of buried my suggestions, even after I brought in outside experts to talk about what was going on with React. And eventually I had to bow out. I sent a presentation. I said, look, I stake my reputation on this. If you do this, your traffic will return. This is the problem. And
looks like you both have this common thing where you're trying to express the value of the changes in implementation. And it's just, you can have wildly different experiences depending if you're embedded in the company or organization, or if you're an independent entirely. So you by backing away, you had to approach it differently, be more careful. Am I right? Does that sound right?
Yes, yeah, and kind of deliver a gift of this presentation to the GM, who I was told not to talk to, right? Like, so I had my hands cuffed. Don't talk to the GM. Anyway, 6 months later, I got a call. The lead dev was no longer with the company. They did finally, after hiring a bunch of other people, hammered out playing whack-a-mole with React, and hammered out the problems and the performance issues, and stuff skyrocketed. So they saw a 60% swing actually to the upside. So it was nice. It's always nice to hear, hey, you were right. That's great. But at the end of the day, I think this person didn't realize I was on their side, right? I'm part of their team. I want to make them look good. It's all about results in the end, and getting the company great results and getting your paycheck, because at the end of the day, they have to be profitable in order to be paying you, right? And that was what I think they missed.
And so you have to be persuasive that you're on their side. And with Katie, when you are on their side, what are the things that you were able to do that ended up succeeding and getting SEO implemented into the workflow there?
I think I was trying to think about what were some pivotal moments that made things start to change. And I think Jessica Bowman's keynote at SMX Advanced last year really hit hard for me, where she was talking about operationalizing SEO. And she was just saying that, you know, anyone touching the website could be making multi-million-dollar SEO decisions without realizing it. And you're always going to be outnumbered by the people who are touching there's never going to be enough SEOs to have an SEO in the room for all of these things. So if you feel like you're running around chasing fires all the time, then you need to operationalize SEO. And is she talking to me? The guy was sitting in the front row. Like, this is me. So then I read her book, the SEO playbook, and I went to another one of her like day-long sessions, and I brought some members from my team with me. And then I was able to get some support around that idea of operationalizing SEO, and like the people who touch the website should be trained on at least foundations of SEO, like at least knowing to ask the question, will this impact SEO, or how will this impact SEO? Because if people are just asking that question, then we have an opportunity to answer, and then they can make a business decision if it's worth considering the SEO risks or not. But prior to that, there wasn't even a question. It was just, I was just running around trying to be like, please get my project in and please stop breaking everything. And it's not that anyone was doing it on purpose. The reasons for the changes were logical. It's just there wasn't enough company-wide training for all the people who had their hands in the website. So we worked a lot this year on offering training opportunities, but that did have to come from leadership support. So we needed the leadership team to appreciate what SEO could do, and the assets that we had, that they were valuable and that we needed to protect them. And so it was worth putting the resources into all the training that we did. And some of that was tech SEO training with the development team. And that was good, I think, just team building too, for us to have shared training together and then work on shared documentation together. So it's kind of interesting. A lot of the times that I felt like I couldn't get on the same page with a developer, like we just had different understandings of a problem. If we wrote it down, like the more that like we wrote down documentation, we're like, is this your understanding? Is this where you're coming from? This is where I'm coming from. The more I realized, like, a lot of the disagreements I thought I was having, we were just using different language because I'm coming from a marketing background and learning technical SEO, whereas they're coming from a programming background. And so I think we're just using different words a lot of the times, and we thought we weren't on the same page when we probably were.
It's such an important topic. And the team building that you talked about, getting on the same page when you're writing documentation together, you are literally on the same page. I mean, that's wonderful. That's how it's going to work. And did you find it more possible as when you discovered that some of the language, we were talking about the same thing, when you got the language together, that you found a lot of the common problems with SEO are some problems that developers are thinking about. They just have a different framing. Accessibility problems, performance problems, these are things that are SEO problems now too. And do you find there's some more increasing commonalities between those things?
I think a big thing I learned is that they weren't working on SEO because they didn't want to. It was more about, like, there's so many things. I think it was about prioritizing it. Like, it wasn't like they were purposely like, I hate SEO, I'm not going to touch it. It was just, there's so much going on that it needed to be prioritized by business impact. And so if it wasn't, and SEO is important, it wasn't, I didn't do a good job at explaining the urgency and storytelling and using data to explain why it was important. Like, I had to, I think, do a lot of reflection of, like, I felt like I was beating the drum and saying this is important, and everyone was saying, yeah, good presentation, good job, you explained it. But then maybe I wasn't circling back enough to being like, okay, what's the next step now? Like, what are we going to do differently now? Or
and as the lone SEO stakeholder in that regard, Jessica's keynote really hit home then, because she's the big in-house SEO personality in our community, and she does a fantastic job of talking about a lot of these issues. And so that must have been right in where you were seeing problems and issues. We have a few comments here. Nick says reverse proxies are the bane of my existence.
Mine too, Nick.
Well, yeah. And that was a problem where you had 1 day difference in looking at statistics and assigning, responsibility for the drop in traffic. And it just, oh, come on,
Yeah.
Nathan says prioritization of dev workflows compared SEO priorities is an ongoing challenge that needs to be carefully managed. And following on that, discrepancies in the workplace vocabulary create unnecessary obstacles. So these are things that we should look to solve. These are things that we should look to, troubleshoot too, if we're new on a project or we're new to an organization. Does that sound like a valuable finding?
Yeah. And I think in addition to Jessica Bowman's book, I really liked learning about Cotter's 8-step change model for that. It's a book that he wrote in the 1990s. He's a Harvard business professor, but it just goes through the steps of leading change. And I think that as SEOs, or even if you're a developer and you're pushing new technical projects, you're going to be part of a change initiative. And so learning how to be a successful change leader, I think, is really valuable. And as I went through the steps and learning about like creating a sense of urgency and getting an advocate who has clout and creating quick wins, like as I was going through the steps, I could see where I was falling short. Like in the beginning, I wasn't creating enough urgency. I was saying like, this is important, this is good, we should optimize this. But I wasn't saying like, the sky's gonna fall down if we don't put some work into this now. So I just think that just learning how to be a change agent, even as a developer or an SEO, I think is really important if you're regularly part of trying to change processes.
And you touched on something there very important as a developer. So as a developer, we have that backlog you described earlier, and that backlog can be a high stack of tasks that we need to complete and get them done. And some of those things are, really fundamental to the way the application works in the first place. So we think of them as extremely highly important. And so if any developer doesn't want to do SEO, if they seem dismissive, their true motivation can range anywhere from like, true disdain for SEO because they just don't like the idea at all, to something more like, I would do it if I could, but I can't. I'm stuck. So, Anthony, there's a couple other companies you mentioned, JW Player and MSN. I'm sure developers know JW Player, but it's not necessarily as familiar. But either that or MSN, everybody's heard of that. So you got a story on one of those two?
Well, yeah, I got a couple. One, JW Player was good. They were on the bleeding edge. I mean, they were before bleeding edge. I mean, they were going to
say they're a JavaScript media player. So yes, that's what JW Player is.
Yes, and so basically, I've been working with them, getting great results. And one day I get a call, and it's the head of marketing, and he says, "Hey, traffic's down like 80%. And I said, wow, okay. Wow, all right, let me check out what's going on. So I'm looking at it, and I'm like, what the hell? What happened? Did you guys do something on the back end? Oh, yeah, we went to this cool new thing, React, but when were you going to run that past me? And this goes to your point, that dialogue, that anything that might remotely affect SEO, even if you don't know enough about it, your SEO is there to kind of take a look, and they're not devs. We're diagnosticians, if anything, right? But we'll be able to guide them and say, yeah, we have to be very careful with this, because of X, Y, and Z, and educate them on it. So, yeah, 80% drop, but they did implement server-side rendering. And this was before Evergreen Chrome and all that, but it worked out great. Everything came back. Things are looking better than they ever were. So
and Evergreen Chrome, Evergreen Googlebot, it fixes a lot, but it doesn't fix everything. So a lot of these problems and a lot of these stories come from before Evergreen, but even post Evergreen, there's still some gotchas. So
well, with the one I was mentioning before, when they went to React, they saw a 20% dip. When Evergreen Chrome hit, we saw a 7% increase. We didn't get back to where we were, right, prior to, but we did see a 7% increase, which is yet another indicator that, something was going on with our React.
So we have some comments here that validate much of what you guys say. We only have a minute or two left, so I'm going to read them and then get some reactions, and then we'll move on. So I've definitely found that pushing accessibility changes along with SEO prioritization have proven difficult from a business case perspective. And Katie, I hope you're thinking about the answers to that one. And then Nathan says, I've always found that trying to understand the developer's KPI goal, key performance indicator goal, and then showing how the SEO tech changes can be incorporated in that workflow would not only decrease their workload, but also improve the business goals. Usually works to win over the devs that I have worked with. That's interesting. Understanding the developer's KPI goal. And Katie, I think that's what you strove to do. You were wanting to understand what drove the developers and their goals.
And I think what really changed is when leadership pushed for us to have a shared performance KPI. So I actually, at one point at SNHU, moved from being on the digital marketing team to actually being on the web team. So I have the same direct report as the person we share KPI. So that was, there were some big moments, but I would say that was a pivotal point too.
That's huge. And what a successful win for SEO and developers being on the team together. Matt asks, conversely, have you found that SEOs with any dev background has helped bridge the gap in understanding? That's actually what we're trying to do here with SEO for developers. I've got some development background and I've got an SEO background, and I'm trying to tie it together and produce as much content as I can in this specific area. Isaac asks, what's everyone's thoughts on push for AMP, page speed insights for local small service-based businesses, think roofer, heating guy, plumber, that is not looking for global traffic or dealing with a vast majority of their clients being off Wi-Fi or in poor connection situations? Interesting, so high speed but local. Looks like they are toning that down to focus more on the KPI of blocks loading and input availability times, and not testing against throttled connections, but more Chrome dev load times. Well, that sounds like a pretty specific question, but we can, kind of globalize it by talking about AMP and page speed. Have you seen any push for AMP at all? I think Anthony, you've got, I know you've got projects where AMP is a push, or you're pushing AMP.
Yes, yeah. For the most part, I push it with everybody. Not specifically on very small businesses, but one in particular, a small not-for-profit organization where we're getting AMP set up. It's just important at this point, especially for smaller sites that might not have the resources to really optimize the performance of their site. They might not have a dev team being able to work on these performance goals and get the load times faster. So AMP is a great solution to that. And I find that even on Upwork, you can find people for a relatively decent amount of money, fairly cheap, to get AMP working. So in a small scenario, I would say that definitely is a go.
All right, last comment, and then we'll sign off for right now, move to phase 2 of the session. Dana Tan says, the way we pushed accessibility plus SEO fixes is we went to the legal team and got a total number in dollars that we had been sued for with regards to non-compliance to ADA standards. And Katie, I know that your dev team has to focus on
Yep, I think we're just working on making SEO and accessibility both part of our DNA for the website. But I haven't found the issue where putting accessibility and SEO together created a problem. It sounds like there was 2 different comments, one where they worked well together and one where it created an issue. And I found for the most part they go hand in hand, like they complement each other.
I think so too. I think that's the way it should be. You should strive for that anyway. If you're having problems, keep working on it, because there is a way to get into a common language there. And this business case and the risk management of potentially being sued is one of those areas you can focus on as the SEO going to devs for that. Anthony and Katie, thank you very much for your insights today. Very much appreciated. You guys have been wonderful, and it looks like you've got great questions. So I hope you can stick around and pipe in on the Google Meet post session and answer some more. So thank you again. Thank you both. Awesome.
Okay, bye.
Okay, and for our next part of the session, we're going to get right into some development work. I'd like to introduce Russ Jeffery, Director of Strategic Integrations at Duda. He's here to talk about the challenge that modern front-end libraries like React and Vue, which we just discussed, have in SEO, and why SEOs might want to implement server-side rendering. So you're going to get the server-side rendering goodies on this one. Otherwise known as SSR, server-side rendering. He'll then run through common techniques to implement SSR with React and Vue, and what developers will need to keep in mind to keep the pages speedy and search engine friendly. And I also noticed there are some optimization tips in there as well.
Absolutely.
So once again, if you've got questions, don't feel free to ask at any time. Just scroll down and pipe your questions in on the bottom. Welcome, Russ.
Thank you.
How are you doing?
I'm doing very well. How are you?
Excellent. We've had a good discussion. I hope you had a chance to tune in and you're ready for your presentation.
Yeah, I feel like you guys set me up perfectly. My presentation here is going to be very much focused on the developer communication side, and this is definitely focused on how developers can understand a little bit more of the SEO nuance that goes into a lot of the things SEOs will bring to the table as part of their recommendations and their optimizations that they're going to come up with. So SSR is absolutely one of these topics that is only becoming more important. So I'm very happy to be here. So jumping in, just a little bit of background on myself. I'm the Director of Strategic Integrations at Duda. What's relevant for this conversation today is I take care of any SEO development that happens within our web design platform. So this is ensuring that we implement every single best practice possible. We give the flexibility and the tools related to that. So I've managed that as one of my many roles at Duda for about 6-7 years now. So that's why I'm here. That's why I'm part of the conversation. Let's dive into the actual content and discuss what is SSR. So server-side rendering is essentially when you deliver the full content of a page down to a visitor or the browser when somebody comes to the site. Now, this might sound a little unintuitive, but actually a lot of these modern front-end frameworks with actually Anthony had a bunch of problems with this. They actually don't deliver the content directly to the browser itself. So these frameworks are things like React, like Vue, like Angular. Svelte is another example, which is becoming very popular today. It's getting quite a lot of buzz in the community.
It's awesome.
Exactly. Ember is another, but there are more than just these 5 that I've listed. There's things like Preact is another one. There are a handful of these tools and technologies out there where all of the content that you're seeing on a website is actually loaded with JavaScript in the browser. And this creates kind of some SEO problems for how Google and other search engines really identify content. Just a little bit of a look back. Historically, if you're looking at the 90s, the 2000s, the early aughts, a server is essentially responding with full HTML down to the browser. This is your traditional of, hey, I'm writing the HTML, or I'm using a tool like WordPress, or I'm using a tool like Dreamweaver to build and generate that actual kind of static HTML. Now today, with these front-end frameworks that are much more dynamic, and the way it works is that the server just responds with the code. It responds with JavaScript. JavaScript then renders all of this content and then displays it down to the browser. Now this goes and it creates a bit of a problem for search engines to really understand what the content of the page is, because when they first come, when a crawler comes directly to the web page, they're not getting that content immediately. They need to then go and actually run that JavaScript and execute it before they can get there. And so this actually gets to exactly, you guys had a little bit of this conversation in the previous talk of Google going what they call is evergreen. And what that means is they're on the latest version of Chrome always. And that they're actually rendering and loading all of the JavaScript when they come to the web page itself. So if we dig in a little bit on how Google actually goes and renders content, this will really kind of flesh out a lot of this information for you guys in terms of understanding what really is happening here. So if we start here on the left side, you can see that the first thing that Google is going to do is they find a URL, right? They find essentially, great, either you submit a sitemap to them, they're crawling and they find a URL on a web page, something like that. Google identifies that this page exists and Google should try and crawl that page. They then go and actually execute that crawl process and download that initial HTML from the browser. What they'll then go and do is they try and process that. If they can understand the content, if they can understand information about it, things like the title tag and the content that exists in the body, or if there's a description, that helps Google understand that content a lot faster. Or if there's a link in the page, they can actually go and send that link back, and so they actually go then crawl that additional page within the website that they might have not known about. But if you're not delivering the actual content as part of that HTML, Google then needs to go and send this into a queue, a render queue as they call it. And this is where they're actually going and running all of that JavaScript, downloading a lot of that additional information, and then they have to go and process it and render it. And this is this very resource-intensive process. Actually, in a previous presentation I gave, I talked about how things can break down in between this process where Google will not send things into the render queue, or they will see things as too similar and they will not actually go and render the actual JavaScript page. So you do need to be careful that you are asking Google to actually render all of this. The other problem that this presents is just slower. Google has to go and spend time to go and render all of these pages. Now, I think Google says the average page to be rendered is about 10 seconds or so. It's not a long time, but in some cases it can take minutes or hours for some of the more extreme cases for that content to be rendered. But they have to go and render all the content, and then they push that back into that processing before it even gets indexed at all. So if you're delivering this HTML sooner, if you're delivering that content as part of that initial response from the server, you're going to be giving Google and other crawlers, in fact, more information quicker so they can understand the content of that page itself. So just keep that in mind. This is the real depth behind why SSR, or why server-side rendering is important, is because of all of this extra processing that's really required for them to load JavaScript that's there. Just going through this, I've talked so far about indexability as the primary problem of what server-side rendering solves. But it also does help with some of these other items as well. So one is speed. It is simply faster to not have to have the browser render a lot of this content. A lot of people have visited a web page and had a white page for several seconds. Most of the time, that's because JavaScript is running, and JavaScript takes a long time to run. So if you're delivering that content faster through server-side rendering, it is going to speed up the page experience. Tooling. This is one that actually is actually a big frustration for developers. I'm willing to bet if any developer on the line has gotten a report from an SEO that says, here are the 10 structural HTML changes we need to make to the page. And the developer might go and look at that and say, hey, this is a false positive, or this is something that's not working correctly. And often that's because a lot of the tools that SEOs are using might not actually support JavaScript, and they might not run that JavaScript as well. Perfect example of this is Screaming Frog. The free version of Screaming Frog doesn't render JavaScript. So it's only looking at that initial page request and loading that. Screaming Frog does, if in the paid version, you can enable a JavaScript renderer, but a lot of people don't enable that, and it's not the default setup of Screaming Frog. So any of these tools that SEOs use might be scanning the site and expecting that full HTML and that full content response right at the beginning. And so I'm sure developers have had to deal with a lot of these headaches of, I'm not quite sure what this means or what that report means or how to fix that. There's a previous comment about Lighthouse kind of reporting and not really being sure about how to respond to that. So tooling is one I think that's really underappreciated today in the SEO community. And the final one is social sharing. So this is a quick point, but it's about things like I'm sharing my webpage on Facebook or Instagram, and Facebook tries to pull an image and they try and pull the title and a description. I can tell you for absolute fact that Facebook does not render JavaScript. So if you're loading the Open Graph tags or the Twitter cards after the fact with JavaScript, they are not going to find those, and that's going to create kind of some social sharing problems too. So SSR helps solve a lot of these problems online today. Especially, they help the interoperability with other systems, right? Your website is going to be crawled by a lot of other systems. SSR really helps that interoperability across the web in general, and especially for indexability and especially for SEO. So hopefully I've been able to really set up a lot of the problem of why a lot of these front-end frameworks are causing these issues in the first place, and understand why it's important. Let's actually dive in now and start talking about how to solve these in two different examples. So I'll run through two examples of actual code with both React and Vue. The examples I'm giving are with a Node.js backend. Node.js is also a JavaScript backend as well. So you're doing JavaScript on the front end and JavaScript on the server or on the backend as well. You can solve this with other frameworks. If you have Python on the backend or you have PHP on the backend, there are other tools to do it. It's a little bit harder to accomplish. You need to take a few more steps. But you can do it, and I have some links here if you want to link through. These are some GitHub profiles. If you want to download the presentation after and get access to them, you can come and see some of these other services. I do mention here Next and Nuxt. These are full frameworks for React and for Vue that have a lot of these best practices baked into them. So Next and Nuxt have server-side rendering as a native part of what they do, and you can enable it very easily. So if you're starting a new project, those are things to look at, but they won't obviously work with an existing project. So let's get into the real examples. So the first example I'll go through here is React. So there's 4 steps here that I have to what you need to go through to set up a server-side rendering for React. The first thing I'm showing here is just a very simple React application. So this is if I were writing the actual markup for the client side or for the browser. This is just a simple, great, I have a navigation, then I have a body, and the body is saying, load the content of the body based on the URL. So in this case, it can be the home page for the path is just /, or it can be blog post pages in this example. So I could have many different blog posts on the site itself, and the React app is just saying, great, load this content or load that content, dependent on what the page path is. It's not too important for this example, but it's just to get an idea of what that front end looks like. On the back end, what we want to do is we want to go and say, great, I want to render this HTML on the back end. I want to load that HTML directly from the server. So we are using what's called Isomorphic Code here. So you'll notice I'm importing React. That is the same React library that you'd be using on the front end as you'd be using on the back end. So you're running that same process to actually generate the HTML that would happen in the browser, and you're also doing it on the server as well. So I'm also going to be using Express. Express is a Node.js framework for running servers. It makes it easy to kind of get a server up and running and responding to requests. And then I'm also using some other libraries called React DOM server, and then a static router as well. And the router looks at the specific URL. Now, the next step that we have here on our server is configuring Express to respond to the request. So this app.get is saying for any request from a browser, we are going to say, great, we need to go and generate the HTML for that page itself. So this is saying any URL they're visiting. This can be /blog / blog post 1 or anything like that. we're generating it. We're then going and generating some context. This context is really going to be specific to your backend and your technology. This is the data in your database. If we're going with the blog example, the data would be great. I have a post title, I have an author, I have the date that this was posted, I have the content that's there, I might have a primary image that I'm using. That would be the context or the data that's related to that blog post. So I need to go and fetch that. In my example here, I kind of omit this because it's going to be different for every implementation. And then finally, we then go and actually basically use that React DOM server to generate HTML. So what we're doing here is we're using this render to string function, which is saying, great, grab these components from React and actually go and fully render them out based on the URL and give me that HTML. So I'm actually generating the HTML of the page on the server side, and that's what's happening right there. The next step of what you want to do is you want to go and grab your index file. This index file is like it's like a template. It's all the other content that you have within a page. It's the header that says, great, I have the title tag in the header, and I have some script tags in the header, and I have some meta tags in the header. Also, anything that might come after, like any body. The template is just kind of like the shell of the page, or the index file is like the shell that goes around the content itself. Next, we're actually then just going to respond with the server. That's what this return, that res.send is. And what we're doing is we're replacing the root content or the body of the content with that generated HTML. So the server is responding with that full HTML response as well from the server. And it's going to be that exact same HTML that would instead be rendered on the client side. And the final step here is just setting up the server to actually listen for a traffic on a specific port. That's just a very kind of a simple example of what the server would look like when responding to a server-side request and kind of the logic behind it. The next step that we want to do, and this is back on the client side or on the browser side, we then want to go and actually hydrate. Now it's a pretty technical concept, but normally when you're running a React application, you do React.tom and you do a render function here. And the render is saying, great, load this HTML. But because that HTML already exists, we don't want to re-render it. If you did re-render it, you get a flicker on the screen for a millisecond when React is re-rendering the content there and reloading it. So to prevent that flicker, we have this thing called a hydration. This is built into React. And the hydration just says, okay, this HTML already exists, but I want to plug in the rest of the React functionality into the actual element that exists there. So this attaches click events so you can navigate around, change pages. All of the standard React functionality then kind of loads in and takes over on the browser side. And then that's all you need to do to set up your React app and have everything up and running. The final step that I have here is taking this a step further and really trying to optimize it a bit more for SEO. So in this case, I'm going back to that res.send that I had earlier, and I'm actually adding in things like the title. So into that page, I'm saying, great, we're going to have a dynamic title that's returned from the server to say, cool, we're inserting the title in there, or we're implementing a canonical tag on this page. If we're worried about duplicate content, we can implement the canonical to say, great, this is the source of truth of this page. You can do the same thing for open graph tags, the same thing for a meta description. If you have a multi-language site, you can do hreflang tags. A lot of these things can also be injected in for the title tag there. So that's setting up within React using kind of their built-in server-side functions as well. So let's jump on, and the next example here is Vue. Vue is very similar to React, but they have kind of a different way of going about building. But you'll see a lot of the same concepts built into Vue directly there. So Vue, this is an example of like a template page that would exist. So in the previous example, the equivalent is that index page that I mentioned, where we are just adding in dynamic fields here. So you can see I have a title, I have meta tags that I'm going to include with either double handlebars or triple handlebars. And then the body of the page will actually be rendered and replaced with this current placeholder there. So if we jump into the actual code, it's going to be very similar. One, we're leveraging kind of the same isomorphic concept that we were with React. So we're loading that same Vue library, and we're also using Express as well in this example too. Here, we're also grabbing that index file. And that index file is the same one I had on the previous page, just showing, great, we're grabbing that and we're reading it from the file itself. And the final thing we're doing is we're loading the renderer. So this is another library, the Vue server renderer, that's provided by Vue directly. It's part of their ecosystem of kind of extensions. And so I'm importing that and I'm using it as part of the code. What I'm doing there is I'm passing in that index file as the source. I'm creating that initial render. The next step is I'm loading that context. Same thing as before, where I'm loading information about that specific page or about what's being accessed on the client side. So in this case, I'm just setting a title and I'm setting some meta tags that's there that'll be injected into the page directly. The next step here is actually setting up our server to respond to that request. So similar to the example as before, we're telling Express to respond to GET requests for any URL on the website. And then we're saying, great, Vue, go and actually initialize yourself and grab this template that's being rendered right here. So we're saying, great, Vue is being initialized, and then Vue is going to go and process that request and turn that into HTML. And then finally, we're using that renderer to render everything to a string. And so what we're doing is we're taking the Vue app, we're passing in the Vue app, we're passing in the context, and then that's returning the raw HTML string, which I'm then just injecting and responding directly to the server with the full HTML of the page. So you see very similar concepts of we're using Vue, we're generating the HTML of the page, and then we're responding to that request. And so you see that over and over and over as part of the kind of the same pattern of how this works. And finally, we're doing that same hydration process. So on the client side, we want to make sure that we hydrate the application. In Vue, it's just called the mount function instead of hydrate, but it's the exact same concept otherwise, where we're initializing the template, and then we're just making sure that Vue understands that they need to connect into that template directly. So those are two patterns for how to implement both with React and with Vue. And you can see that it takes a little bit of forethought, it takes a little bit of kind of planning to get this done, but it really is kind of a best practice today to implement a lot of this server-side rendering directly as part of the process of building sites as well. So that's it from a presentation and a content perspective. And Detlef, I believe we have several questions as well.
If we do, we do. Thanks for tipping me off there. Love coding with Svelte. Someone had a comment on that. Svelte is a new framework. Now you went through React and showed React, which is sort of like the big boy of the
right.
JavaScript libraries, and then you also discussed Vue, which actually a Googler peeled off and created. It's Evan Wu, I think, is the one that is the person who invented Vue. And he's practically single-handedly putting together the framework. It's in a pretty exciting community around Vue as well. Mm-hmm. And the differences that struck me, as a good point of content or context is like you're in React shipping the app shell basically and hydrating it, and you choose which components you want to be as part of the shell. And that's really the SEO thinking around this, isn't it? Like that's really where you want to put in your strategy. What parts do I want to ship with the shell, and what parts can I hydrate later? Yeah. And so depending on your site and page, that's the kind of thing you want to think about. And is there anything that you want to maybe talk about in terms of deferring. So, I mean, obviously hydrating is a defer strategy, but also when the page is actually rendered, and if you're starting to look at Web Vitals, you might want to defer further than just doing this deferment of hydrating, but defer even more because you've got styles. Maybe you want to put some of those styles in line to make those scores snap for you in Web Vitals and performance, and defer it later with JavaScript or something. So any thoughts around further deferment after shipping the shell and then hydrating?
Yeah, definitely. I think this is a pretty big problem, I think, today for folks that have used, what some of these frameworks where, when I'm rendering that blog post in my previous example, or I'm rendering the page, I only want to load, my code that's related to that blog post page. I might have other types of pages on my site. I might have a page for recipes or content or health information on my site, but I don't want to load all of that same code that's used to render those pages. And so what you're talking about of deferring is saying, great, let's only load what I need to for the blog posts. And a lot of these frameworks, or a lot of the way developers work today, is they bundle all of these things into one big JavaScript file. And so when you go and load a page, you're loading all of the code that's needed for the blog post, you need all the code that's needed for the recipe pages, you need all the code that's needed for other types of pages on the site. And they're not what's called like splitting that code up into different areas. And this creates really big JavaScript files, but it also creates a lot of that experience that I mentioned, that white screen effect. And so this is a real like speed optimization that needs to really be looked at by a lot of developers of how can I split that up and how can I defer loading? How can I say, great, I only want to load the recipes pages and the related features once people come and visit that page and not as that initial request. It's a difficult problem to solve. A lot of these tools have really gotten serious about this in the past year or two and really have started to bake this in. So this is one of the reasons I mentioned Next or Nuxt is they have some of these things built in by default as part of the library and framework where they implement a lot of those best practices. If you're using just React straight, it's not that directly. So, yeah.
Right. And the idea of bundling everything to one script file is great from that initial thought, but then with this deferred idea of deferring it, the reason it's important is in order for the page to load, like you're saying, if you're just staring at a white screen, that's because that huge JavaScript file has a backlog of tasks that are consuming the thread. The main thread is busy.
Right.
It's busy just chunking through all your JavaScript before it gets a chance to paint. So you got that's why you have these problems, and that's why you want to look at these things and break your bundle down so that you can defer loading these other scripts that are less important than something that could add to your scores in Web Vitals, like first input delay. How long does it take for the page to be ready to respond to a click or a scroll or a keyboard input? And that could be seconds. We've all had the experience where we try to click on a button and it just doesn't work until there's like 3 seconds later, and then all of a sudden it works. It's because the thread was busy. It couldn't process that event handler until 3 seconds later.
That's exactly right. This is what Google is really trying to solve with their new Web Vitals, of giving you those key metrics up front and calling that out and telling you that you have these user experience problems on their site that they're identifying. And a lot of the root causes end up being some of these things that we were mentioning before, the bundle sizes, and including a lot of these additional libraries. It really does. These frameworks, they're great on one hand because they allow developers to move quickly and scale their applications very easily. But on the other hand, a lot of them haven't taken these user experience or performance things into account. And developers need to kind of look and just make sure that they're really hitting a lot of those user expectations from the actual experience, which is missing. And Google has done a good job highlighting these, I think, actually, with how they've updated their vitals, and also how they've been really evolving Lighthouse to have these coherent kind of signals that they're giving. Yeah.
And the dev tools are fantastic. Chrome dev tools. Oh man.
Yeah.
So how much experience have you had with Svelte?
Me personally, I don't have a lot.
Yeah.
I've done their basic, like hello world type stuff, but I haven't dug in too much more than that. It's something I want to do. I have not though. Yeah.
And the main thing with Svelte is they're on version 3. This is the third Svelte is the one that's taking off because they had Svelte 1 and 2, and I had built my Hello Worlds in Svelte 2.0, I think. But 3 is the one that's taking off, and I'm enjoying watching it. I've actually reached out a little to Rich Harris to see if he might want to participate in some of our discussions. Great. Stay tuned for that. But the thing is that it's kind of like it tips the whole thing on its head and say, hey, why don't we run a compiler that generates the reactive JavaScript baked right in line with the code and send the whole HTML string? I mean, the server-side rendering on Svelte is very natural. It's a natural thing to do because that's the process that it's doing. So that's the notion of Svelte and why it's taking off. Right now it's probably in third place. The third mentioned go to Hampshire, don't you?
Yeah, definitely. I think, broadly you see a lot of organizations adopting React because A, it's backed by Facebook, and B, it has a big community and it's well established. But you see a lot of the developer excitement, at least in surveys that I've read. You see a lot of it for Vue, of developers saying, I want to use that, I want to test that. And you see a lot of that same excitement in recent ones related to Svelte. And so it hasn't been adopted yet, but it's something developers are excited about using. And so they probably will, sometime in the future.
Oh, definitely. I mean, you're hearing the Svelte community, the ones that are spearheading it, talking about, hey, if you've got a production Svelte app, let us know. We want to know about it. And so they're hoping to get some momentum that way. And also, just basically right now, if you're job hunting, Svelte wouldn't be the framework. This would be something you would do more for your own personal development and growth, because there are much more React jobs and even Vue jobs than there would be, and even Angular jobs. There are very few or almost non-existent jobs for Svelte right now. But it's taking off, and as it gets this developer momentum, it could be a superstar. I mean, Vue started off small and it exploded. And it's a terrific framework. I mean, you can see, and this isn't really a good judge of quality of framework actually, but you can see how much simpler it is when you look at the amount of stuff you have to write for React versus the amount of stuff you have to write for Vue. And in Svelte, it's even slimmer. So, they have a great shorthand with a $= which powers some of their template things. They endear a few things to make their for example, the way things are reactive is on state change, and it just, as soon as one variable has a state change, whatever it's connected to changes automatically. So these things happen really natively, and Svelte is an amazing framework, something to keep an eye on. Now, Brandon says, I hope Russ. Yeah, Brandon says, I hope Russ talks about these frameworks, how they affect CLS or cumulative layout shift.
Yeah. Yeah, I can a little bit to that if you'd like. Yeah. Sure. It's also a challenge with some of these frameworks where you try and make sure that with the way React works is you have several components that make up the entire page. So you have a sidebar component, and you have a main content component. You might have a header component, and then within that header you might have a navigation component. And React tries to make sure that you're rendering all of that at the same time, but it's not always perfect. And you might have a thing where, great, within that component, you're loading an image. That image needs to then go and download, and then that will have its own shift that happens. So cumulative layout shift is essentially, or CLS is when you're loading a page and you see content move and jump around, and that's a bad experience. And so you need to really dive in and make sure that during that loading experience, that it doesn't shift around as much as possible. And these frameworks don't really help much with that. They sometimes make it quite a bit harder to leverage and implement that. One example of this, just quickly, is with images, where a best practice now is to really include like a height and a width on the images itself, because it takes up the space. Even if that image doesn't load, you're still saying, great, this image is 300 pixels high and 500 pixels wide, whatever it might be. and it's going to take up that space even when it's still loading into the page. Because you have that empty space, the other content around it is not going to be, jumping down as well. So that's something to look at, and it's not something that React or Vue has traditionally really helped with. Yeah.
In fact, that would be arguably an old best practice that has been around for eons, but the advent of the new JavaScript frameworks kind of do away with that stuff.
That's right.
In favor of just getting the thing running, getting an app framework going and reaching critical mass. And so those things were decided as less important. Well, circle back to the future, which is where we are now. The width and height attribute are key to carving out that content layout. Otherwise, hey, man, your content is going to shift, and we've all had that experience. It's a terrible experience when content shifts. If you're reading something and suddenly it shoots away. I mean, I'm having that problem with the comment section right now, actually. So it's like, this is an issue that affects the real readability and performance of your page. And so the way they calculate it is that where is the start point of an element and where is the end point if an element moves, and how far does it move and how much of the viewport is occupied by that element. So if we're talking about the top of a page, you've got like a hero image, right? And it hasn't downloaded, but if you haven't given it the height and width attributes, text will show up there in the text flow of the document object model. The text will be up there until that image loads and then pushes all that text down. So you'll see the text and then it gets displaced by the hero that suddenly pops into view. That'll be a horrible CLS score right there. So
exactly. Let alone if you had a call to action on the screen and somebody was trying to click on that button and they click on something else because your screen moved. That's even worse, and that's gonna basically.
But you have the facility in React and Vue to assign these width and height attributes. Am I right? It's just
absolutely.
It's just so it's not a hard thing for an SEO to find cumulative layout shifts. A tech SEO finds these things, submits it to maybe a React developer and say, hey, please assign height and width. This should not be a big ask at all. It should be very simple.
It is and it isn't, right? It's very straightforward to go and say add a height and a width, but a developer would say, I want to automate this. I don't want to have to do this. If I write 5 more blog posts in the future and I have different images, I want to make sure that I set this automatically for future things too, so we don't have to come back to it. And so that's
an excellent point,
right? They need to go through that thought process of, oh, I need to think about the future of what the possible images that I'm going to have there. So,
yeah, I'm actually facing that issue now with user-generated content. So it's like, how do I know what size their images are that they upload? Well, I have to run a separate bash process to run, identify using image magic or something to get the dimensions back, or something. Or you can use JavaScript, but that's too late. So you got to find some way of somehow grabbing the dimensions, by some process in order to assign the values. Automating that is going to be, in some cases, it'll be easy if it's in a template and it's a page as part of a template, or an image or it's media that's part of a template. That's when it'll be easy.
That's exactly right. This might be a little too weedsy, but there are some new ways to kind of solve this. Some new CSS ways to say, I know that as part of my design of this blog post, I'm not going to allow images to be bigger, or I have a specific basically ratio that I'm using on the page of how big that image ratio is going to be. So you can actually set that ratio in CSS today. But that takes a little bit of foresight to say, I know all of these images are going to be roughly the same, and we're going to fit it into that ratio that's there on the page itself. So you can solve it that way, but it's still a problem.
I just read about that CSS ratio statement. It's something that I wasn't familiar with because I think it's relatively new. Am I right? Because and I read it, of course, researching Web Vitals, and I saw that was one of the things. I'm like, so that looks like a great strategy for solving that using CSS. That might be, and I believe Adi Osmani, who does the, he's part of the Web Vitals team.
That's right. I watched his presentation at his web.dev live. They had it about a month and a half ago. I think he talks about that, and I read his blog post that corresponds to that
session and everything on that CSS.
Right.
So I'm glad you brought it up because I saw that. I'm like, oh, that's great, but I haven't yet had a chance to dig in enough and actually implement it in part of any of my projects yet. But I plan to. Yeah. All right. So there's this discussion going on in the comments about it doesn't matter how great the content is if a search engine can't understand, see it, or index. Don't get me wrong, I don't think everyone needs to be a technical SEO, but in my humble opinion, understanding some basic technical SEO is a requirement, as is understanding the importance of content, even when you are a technical SEO. So there's the discussions lively, apparently, going on in our audience that are like, do we really need to know all this technical stuff? Or if we know all this technical stuff, ho-hum, but wait, and the content is still important. I liked seeing how you implemented the SEO in your Vue demonstration, showing how, and you're still going to want to replace the title and the meta with, the corresponding fields that you've got stored for this page, for this resource. And the canonical, you showed the canonical. You had the rec.hostname, path and everything to power canonicals, and then you can go all the way. And you mentioned that you can get into schema. You could get into schema there.
Absolutely.
That access point.
Yeah, 100%. Yeah, it's an interesting line of like how far SEOs need to go into the technical field. I think the reality is, if you're able to at least communicate these things, it brings more value to the table. And it makes you better at your role and more effective. So I think, dabbling a little bit in this as an SEO is important. Obviously, you don't need to go to the depth that you and I are talking about here of how you bundle your packages and load them later. A lot of that for like true SEOs is going to be a little too in depth probably. But making sure that you're thinking you're able to put things in the position of what does Google see and what is Google expecting and how are they finding the content, putting it in that perspective so developers can take that and understand, okay, Google is looking at things differently than a visitor to my website, trying to put that context in place. I think that's a valuable skill set to have as an SEO. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. And you want to provide that feedback, and from the developer standpoint, you want to understand how Google is rendering your stuff, because they're not rendering anything but your shell at first. They make a decision at that point. Do we render this? Do we expend the resources, because it is resource intensive? Do we expend the resources to render this or not? They can do it and they will do it. And then what content there may be delayed in its indexing anyway. So is that something? So you have to make the decision as well with your SEO, which is what I loved having Katie as part of the team of developers. She now reports to the same people. I mean, that example is terrific. I really do think that companies should look at that and make sure to understand that SEO is basically an addendum, or at least a part of the developer team. And bring them right in. Get the developers to learn the agile process. They don't necessarily have to know development, but they got to be, capable enough to find some of these scores and some of these things that are part of the ranking algorithm now. I mean, that Web Vitals is going to be a part of the ranking algorithm in 2021 sometime. This stuff is really important. No, you don't have to know code, but you have to understand what these metrics mean, where to go find them. And so you're going to want to look at the Chrome dev tools to find them so that you can help coach the developers into seeing the same thing and understanding how they might look at that and go, and it might trigger a solution to them in their mind, like, oh, let's go change this thing. Eric, a fan of Svelte, says Svelte is lit, LOL. Now with TypeScript, which is actually a new thing, because for the longest time they were hoping to get TypeScript, which is a type-safe JavaScript super language. Let's see. Lou asks, are progressive web applications as good as they are hyped to be? PWAs. Whilst stating that they render everything in the server and Googlebot sees the full HTML of the pages, they still use JSON LD to add metadata to pages, e.g. meta titles, descriptions, image alt, and structured data. Crawling with Screaming Frog, you need to have JS rendering enabled to see this information.
Right.
Isn't that maybe an indication that Googlebot is not seeing this information so easily?
Yes and no.
Yeah, yes and no.
I think, look, I tried to cover this a little bit in the presentation, but I think, Google does, they do render JavaScript. They do load all of this. They try and load as much as possible, but it becomes just a little questionable of what exactly is Google able to do and able to render in the actual kind of render process for the pages. And so if things are really delayed and they're loading late, and they take a long time, they might not load, like Google may never see them. If it's loading pretty quickly, and your JavaScript is not very heavy, then Google's going to have a much easier time finding and rendering that content. This can get very deep very quickly, and a lot of times when you start trying to figure out what are the rules of how Google will find things and not, it's really going to be on a case-by-case basis of what Google is able to render and what they're not. I know, Detlef, you have Martin on in I think on day 3. He's really great at trying to parse this a lot better than I'll be, of like what Google really understands and what they read when crawling. But if I were to answer the first part of the question is, are progressive web apps all they're hyped up to be? In my opinion, I think they're great. Right? Google is trying to close the gap between a native application and the web itself. And they're doing that through PWA and adding in a lot of these features like push notifications, like installing it locally, like being able to set up kind of the branding and color scheme with the manifest files. A lot of these things Google is trying to kind of close that gap with PWAs. And I think it's an important evolution for the web in general to keep it as relevant as possible and as functional as possible. Now, I think the reality is that a lot of these things aren't as adopted. The web can still very much be text and images and video, and that's it, and not a lot of these more immersive functionalities. But I think it's a good effort that we're going through, and I think it is worth it. So.
Yeah, you've got a little folder that your website gets installed into, and the folder will actually run JavaScript service workers to do little tasks, even if you're disconnected from the internet.
That's right.
So it's a pretty cool. So you can have a notification even if you're disconnected at a time-based notification happen, even if you're completely disconnected to the internet. So PWAs are progressive web apps are terrific for what they were designed, what requirements they were designed to meet, and that's really these low connection, spotty connection, intermittent connection situations. So you can actually run a little app and even have it run things offline. So for that purpose, it's terrific. It's not there for an SEO kind of thing per se, but you can optimize your PWA website. There's a quick circle back to the images thing. Corey asks, because we were doing, and this is an important question to answer. We were talking about aspects in the new CSS aspect statements. What about responsive images? How do you do that? Because you've got a width 100% and a height that's set to auto to make a responsive image actually shrink and expand based on your viewport. So what about that?
Yeah, I think first of all, most images will, using that aspect ratio thing we mentioned, the image will respond to the width of the screen, so it will reload. Now, that being said,
how does it affect on commutative layout shift? How does it affect that kind of thing?
It should be the same, because the image aspect ratio is going to be the same no matter what size screen you're on. If you're loading that full image, unless you're doing some manipulation with CSS of only loading a certain part of the image or setting it as a background image, so you're loading like the middle of it but not the sides of it. Unless you're doing something like that, it should be the same for CLS in that sense. Now,
that's what I got from the thing too. Yeah, go ahead.
Just the one thing I'll mention is there's always the problem of the actual pixel size of the image, right? If you're uploading a big image, you do want to use some of the responsive image tools to say, great, I'm going to have several different image sizes. One is a desktop size, another is a tablet size, maybe a mobile size that would exist. And you want to make sure that you're generating several versions of that image, because it's simply a waste to download a 3,000 pixel width image on a mobile device. You're downloading many extra megabytes that won't be necessary. So there are a lot of great ways to implement responsive images in terms of what is the size of the phone and what image I load correspondingly.
That's like the data source attribute on the image tag with the different versions depending on the resolution of this viewport.
That's exactly right. You use media queries to get the right dimensions. Yeah. Right.
And I did read just I think yesterday that the cumulative layout shift score is calculated on the size of the image as it's displayed, not necessarily the actual size of the image itself. So if you have an image that's pixelated because you've blown it up, and it moves and shifts, it'll add to your CLS score more. If you have a big image and you've gotten it only really a small, because you're defining the dimensions as small, it won't ding you for the big size of the image on your CLS score. It'll just be the small part that is consuming the portion of the viewport that's currently in view. And so that's something that's kind of a cool, Google tries to be helpful when
they do, yeah.
They do. So Stephanie asks, I'm trying to diagnose whether an SPA, which is a single page app, content will be visible to search engines when it launches. The content is visible in the DOM, but not rendered in HTML when I put it in a mobile-friendly test.
Ooh.
What does this mean?
that sounds like a problem, Stephanie. The mobile-friendly test from Google is the closest thing you're going to get to what Google sees as a search engine. So if you're not seeing that content in the HTML, you can ignore the screenshot. Look at the actual HTML that the mobile-friendly test is giving you back. If you're not seeing that content, then Google is not going to find that content after the fact. So you want to make sure that that content in its HTML form exists there as part of the mobile-friendly test. So definitely, take that up with your team and make sure that they are finding all of that content that's there. That does sound like a little bit of a problem. Yeah.
Yeah, that's definitely a problem. Let's see. And then Ryan asks, with SSR, does the JavaScript platform, when it's rendering, does it allow for caching on some level,
Sure.
or the pre-rendered content to reduce the server load? Just curious what balance is struck if some content is static or the same on initial load.
Yeah, I'm happy to address this. It's a great point. It's another chance for optimization to say, when during the process I was basically taking and loading up the React application, I was grabbing the content, and I was rendering that raw HTML, and the most frequently is that HTML is not going to change very frequently. And so if visitor number 2, number 3, number 4 come, we don't have to regenerate all of that as part of the server-side request. You can do what's called caching, or save it temporarily in something that's faster to access for the server. And so yes, absolutely, you can go and cache that, and I think that makes a lot of sense. And it's really going to depend on your use case of how frequently that content is updating and how frequently you need to go and re-render that HTML to have the freshest and latest content. So connecting that to your backend, CMS or tooling to make sure that the cache is cleared out when content gets updated or something along those lines is also an important step. But caching is absolutely something I would recommend as part of this. Obviously, I didn't get into it because I gave a high level, but it's a great optimization to make in my mind. Yeah.
We have a question about speed. Why is the page speed different for different versions of the same URL? For example, page speed of example.com is different for HTTP example.com, which is different than HTTPS example.com, and then HTTPS www.example.com. So this fellow is Durga is seeing different speeds on each of these. Any thoughts that come to mind? A couple of these are literally different.
Well, the URLs are different. It's hard to say 100% for sure without looking at the real example. My first impression would be one is are you redirecting differently? So if somebody's visiting, if you're inputting HTTP, you're probably going to redirect them to the HTTPS version. And so PageSpeed might be detecting that redirect and saying, oh, you want to minimize these redirects because that takes time as part of the process to go and create a new connection and all of that type of fun stuff. Same example of going from example.com to www, they could be detecting that. So I would look at those. It also looks like you are mentioning that HTTPS is a little bit slower as well. So it is possible maybe the HTTPS connection is slower on the site, which is also a possibility. Some servers take a little bit longer to make that SSL or TLS connection. So I would look at that as well. But I would assume it's the same content otherwise. So hopefully I'm pointing you in a direction to investigate further. Yeah.
Yeah, the TLS connection could be or should be lightning fast because as long as you're going with a, I mean, if it's that, switch certificate authorities.
Right.
Yeah. All right. Let's see. There's a lot of discussion going on around our responsive images thoughts. So, but anyhow, let's see. What's your favorite framework between for search engine for doing optimization and search engine optimization between the big libraries, or do you not have one and you see the differences? Then highlight what differences you'd see and what things are pros and cons between all of the different frameworks, the big ones.
That's a tough one. That's an in-depth question. Yeah. A lot of this for me personally comes down to preference and experience. So I personally have the most experience with Vue. I built a few different applications myself in Vue, and so for me, I'm most comfortable with that. I think the tooling that they provide, like I mentioned, they have like it's built in the router library as part of Vue. They have the server-side rendering as part of the Vue ecosystem, and it plugs in very nicely. So I very much find that easy to use myself. I think many people would say the same about React and say the same about Svelte, right? So I haven't, like we talked about a little bit earlier, I haven't gone too in-depth on Svelte. From your experience, Detlef, it sounds like it's pretty easy and pretty straightforward to use and manage as well as part of this. So. Yeah,
it's the build step that makes it stand out from anything else because a lot of it's built server side and it ships sort of inline JavaScript that does, for all the reactivity. All of these though have components and component libraries. React probably has the biggest component library. So any experience with component libraries, because there is a question. These new technologies as React sometimes use external UI components, removes content from the DOM when they are hidden and is not SEO friendly. So it's great to take that into account. And it's better to use custom components with class names to play with the display CSS property. So I guess what they're saying there is that even though there's a whole library of these components, maybe you create your own or customize to your own so that you can play with that, because not all of them are going to be search engine friendly. Just like WordPress, you can add all kinds of add-ons and just completely bloat out your WordPress and blow it up. I mean, you could do the same with React. You can be like, oh, this looks so great, and just pull it. Same with Vue. It's got a component library as well.
That's right. It's just React. It's like a layer deeper, right? It's deeper in the development process because you're including all of these extra things, and you're right. It can easily bloat the overall size of the website, and the speed of the website can really deteriorate. Yeah.
All right. Well, now's the time to thank you very much. You'd hear all the cheers and applause from everybody. Thank you for all of your insights, and I hope you get a chance to stick around and we can all meet up at the post-session Google Hangout. So thank you, everybody, for attending.
Thank you.
We'll see you tomorrow. Don't forget to tune in same time, same place for the discussion with John Murch on using tools, including Puppeteer, and we'll get into SEO tool making and SEO, the tech SEO process. Okay, thank you very much. Signing off now.